Hey everyone, and welcome to this video. I'm Glenn, and this is episode 21 of the Oathsworn painting series. In this episode, I'm painting Marcella. If you're new to miniature painting, I hope you find this video interesting and helpful. If you enjoy what I do, please hit the like button and leave a comment. Before painting the miniature, I've removed all the mold lines, filled the gaps and cleaned it. Then I made the centerfold prime by priming the model black and then applying a white primer from above, slightly angled. The flames were simply primed white. And here are all the paints I used for this painting guide. With that aside, let's begin. For the base, I start with the speed paints shown on the banners. I don't overthink it, just applying them randomly and blending them together to get a natural look. Next, I move on to the model itself, base coating with the colors shown on the banners. I begin with the skin using Bugman's Glow. This is actually the only non-speed paint color in the base coat phase. Once that's dry, I go over with Crusader skin to get a nice rich tone. For selected areas, I mix 1 part purple with 3 parts base. This gives a muted, slightly desaturated tone that works well. Then I add purple to all the metal parts. Here I use brown on selected areas, like the part on the back and the hood. The book cover gets a coat of purple, because what's a witch without a good, ominous looking spellbook? Now for the cloth around the waist and the draft, I use a mix of purple and beige, blending them directly on the model. Here I simply aim for variation. With the first coat dry, I apply a second layer, starting with a purple and beige mix on the torso and legs. I leave out the sleeves and the cloth between the legs to keep some variation in tones. Here I mix the 3 colors on the palette and apply this to the purple cloth, the book cover and the draft to unify these parts. Next I hit the metal parts and the hair with a purple color. For the brown cloth, I mix purple with brown to get a deep, rich tone and apply that over the initial brown base coat. That wraps up the base coat phase. Now let's move on to the layering. I start with the cloth I want to appear green, using the colors shown on the banners. First I apply a brief coat of dark green as a base. Next I mix in a dark violet to create a deep, desaturated shade and apply it to the shadows or any areas where I want more depth. Now I introduce a lighter green and begin gradually highlighting the fabric. At this stage, I roughly layer the green areas, focusing on the exposed surfaces and raised edges. To keep control over the tones, I create a gradient on the palette, letting me pick the right tone as I go. You'll see me use this technique throughout this tutorial. With a lighter mix, I start adding texture to the cloth, using small brush strokes and stippling to break up the surface. For the final step, I use the brightest color from the gradient on the palette to apply the last layer of texture. This process is also used on the green cloth around the torso. Now I move on to the brown cloth, following a similar process with the colors shown on the banners. I start with a quick coat of dark brown. Then I gradually add texture with brighter brown tones, layering them in to build depth. For the brightest highlights, I introduce beige into the gradient on the palette. I refine the very edges of the brown cloth, giving it a worn, tattered appearance. For the sleeves, I use the colors on the banners, starting with the ends and a brief coat of brown. I add a touch of green to give it a slightly dirty, aged look. From here I build up the layers, following the same techniques used on the other fabrics. For the rest of the sleeves, I aim for a brighter appearance using bone white and ivory white, gradually highlighting. I use the two colors on the fabrics in between the legs as well, using ivory white as the final highlight. Continuing with the last fabric, I use the same layering techniques, but apply tones of violet, brown and beige. I start with a brief coat of violet. Here I apply a thin coat of brown to soften the transitions and tie everything together. Next, I pick out the details on the lid. For the book, I use the colors on the banners, starting with a base coat of a purple mix. Then I add red, using it to introduce highlights and texture. With pure red, I refine the edges to make them pop. Now I use base brown tones to paint thin lines, creating the effect of individual pages. The back of the book was painted with shades of brown. For the small jewelry and bracelets, I stick to the colors on the banners. I start with a quick coat of dark Reaper. Then I begin building up the layers and highlights, gradually refining the details. I also painted the corners of the book as metal, and when I was done with all the metal parts, I added a thin coat of brown as a shade to create some contrast. Now onto the skin, using the colors on the banners. I lay down the first coat with Bogman's Glow. As usual, I work through multiple layers, gradually shifting them toward the most exposed areas and edges to build up the skin tone. Here I mix a custom shade for the fingernails to add a bit of extra detail. For the eyes, I apply ivory white into the eye sockets. Then I carefully place the pupils using a dark color. To refine everything, I go back in with a skin tone to clean up the eyes and define the lips. Now for the symbol on her forehead, following the artwork as a reference. Before that, I added some magenta glazes using Moonlake Coral across her skin to bring in a bit of warmth. Then I deepened the shadows under her eyes and on the chin with a dark violet tone. When working on these small details, remember to breathe, otherwise you might get dizzy. With that done, I move on to highlighting the hair. For the amber piece, I start with a base coat of ivory white, then layer with orange and yellow. Finishing off with a mix of ivory white and yellow to bring out the glow. I use grey tones to refine the bindings on the amber, making them stand out more. For the stitches on the fabrics, I keep it simple and just pick out different colors from the palette that I feel work best. Here's the model pretty much done. Let's put the final touch on the base. For the final layers on the base, I bring in tones of green, yellow, brown and off-white. Then for extra details, I add small dots in orange and violet to break up the texture and make it more visually interesting. Then I go the 2 laps around the base rim with a black color. For the flames, I use the colors shown on the banners. I use an airbrush to speed up the process, but you should be able to achieve a similar effect with a brush. I start with a few coats of lens flare glow over a white primer. Since fluorescent paint is quite transparent, I build up multiple layers to ensure good coverage. Next, I apply radiation glow somewhat randomly, creating variation between bright yellow and orange tones. I keep it light, just a single pass with orange, establishing the base coat, before moving on to layering textures to capture the chaotic movements of flames and embers on this rather even surface. To achieve this effect, I use an expendable brush and stipple on white, creating a random pattern across the surface. There's not much precision here, I just make sure the entire area gets some texture. This step can also be done with a sponge, but I prefer a brush for better control. Now I use an airbrush to apply the yellow fluorescent color. Just a brief pass to create depth. Then I go back in with more white texture. I revisit the areas that already have texture, layering it up to increase depth. This time around, I also added white into selected recesses. This will make the next coat of fluorescent yellow pop even more. And here I apply the yellow fluorescent paint, again just a light coat, to tint the new white textures. Back to adding more white textures, but now I make sure to hit the edges as well. Then I follow up with another thin coat of yellow fluorescent paint. Next, I use speed paint to bring in a warm orange, focusing on some raised areas and edges to create this variation in temperature. When using the airbrush, I add the paint directly into the cup, and it generally sprays smoothly. However, I mix in a few drops of glaze medium to extend the drying time. This helps the paint flow even better and makes cleanup easier. I can simply rinse with water. If you end up with an area that is too dark or orange, you can easily backtrack by adding white texture and layering yellow over it a few times. Now we are back at it again, adding even more texture. This time I'm placing it in the areas I want to appear the brightest. Then another brief coat of yellow to unify the effect. Now more white texture. I begin to shape the flames and embers. I also hit some of the orange areas for variation. You might have guessed it, time for a yellow coat. Now I bring in an orange-red speed paint, applying a very thin coat. Since speed paint is naturally transparent, I control the amount to land somewhere between red and orange. I don't want it to turn fully red. If you end up with splatter or make an area too dark or red, you can easily backtrack by adding the texture layers of white and yellow a few times. Once again, I return to white to build up the final texture layers. Followed by another brief coat of yellow. And here is the second to last layer of white texture. Now the final pass of yellow fluorescent paint by airbrush. For the finishing touch, I apply a last round of white highlights, selectively placing them for maximum brightness. Then I go in with a brush and refine the flames using yellow fluorescent paint, adding extra depth to the newly textured areas. Afterwards, I follow up with the orange speed paint and the red-orange speed paint as well. To sum it up, I started with a base coat of fluorescent yellow, followed by touches of fluorescent orange. From there, I built up layers by alternating between white textures and thin coats of fluorescent yellow. I then apply a touch of orange speed paints in selected areas, before repeating the white texture and yellow layering process a few more times. Next, I introduced a bit of red, keeping it closer to an orange finish. After that, I went through a few more rounds of textures and fluorescent yellow layers. Finally, I added the brightest white highlights and refined everything with a brush for the finishing touches. I think I would like to revisit this technique another time, maybe refine it or even try different colors. If you would like to see me do something like this again, let me know in the comments. With the outer areas of the flames complete, I mirror the process on the other side and finish the base rim with 2 laps of black. With the flames done, I decided to move back to the model to add some object source lighting, also called OSL. For this effect, I use burning ore, focusing on the shadows to mimic the firelight coming from below. I build up the glow with multiple thin layers of orange. I create a more intense, luminous effect on her left arm, the side closest to the flames. I also add subtle highlights to her necklace and bracelets. Then work my way around the model, adjusting the intensity until it feels just right. To brighten the underside of her left arm, I mix in a bit of yellow for the final highlights. With the OSL complete, I add a few tufts to the base for extra detail. And finally I apply matte varnish for a matte finish and to protect the paints. And with that, let's have a look at the final result.
Accursed creatures stand at our gates, and the Painting Chronicles Brotherhood stands at the ready to face this evil. Join our cause by subscribing, and we shall triumph together. Pillar and Path Brothers. Also like and comment.